Hi, I'm Brooke Goldstein, and welcome to another episode of Outspoken. There has been a lot of talk about who's behind the anti-Semitic and racist boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement in the United States and abroad. Is this a grassroots, loosely affiliated, peaceful, and lawful movement, as they claim, that just popped up on campus and started to naturally attract well-meaning students to its cause of Jew bashing? Or is this something directed from the top down and a bit more sinister that we should be wary of? Who are these so-called activists supported by? Who do they take their marching orders from? Who is printing and distributing those nice pocket guides on how to start your own campus hate group? How is it that almost overnight there seems to be a well-funded, well-orchestrated campaign to target, harass, and harm Jewish students, Jewish organizations, and Israeli persons in the United States and abroad? What's behind this massive movement to hyper-politicize the Middle East and radicalize American youth on college campuses to be anti-American and anti-Semitic? Are there any laws being broken by the persons and entities behind the BDS movement? And if so, how do we enforce them? Also, what can we learn from Europe? They seem to be a few years ahead of us, dealing with their own radicalization problems, which has resulted in the rapid rise of anti-Semitism and even terrorist violence against day schools, synagogues, and Jewish delis. Is this coming to our shores? Recall Pittsburgh, and what are we doing to prevent this hatred from rising further in America? Finally, what are our legislators doing today to stop this madness and enforce our nation's laws? We have a riveting episode of Outspoken in store for you right now. Mark Greendorfer is an attorney at the Tri-Valley Law Firm, and he is the co-founder and president of the Zachor Legal Institute. Mark has done a significant amount of work mapping out the potential violations of U.S. federal and state laws, including anti-terrorism and anti-racketeering laws, that the entities and individuals funding and overseeing BDS activity, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions activity against Israel in the United States, may be subject to. Mark, thank you for joining us from sunny California today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be on.
Thank you. So tell me, how did you get into this area in the first place? How did you get to the point where you submitted a very well thought out and argued letter to the Department of Justice calling for the investigation of what you call certain domestic affiliates of foreign terror organizations that are operating here in the United States and are influencing, if not organizing or behind, the so-called BDS movement?
Well, it started when we were first drafting one of our original law review articles on BDS under federal law generally. And we were looking for federal laws that they may be violating. And at that time, it was around 2016, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer was going before the House, and he laid out in testimony ties between Hamas promoters and BDS promoters. And at that point, we realized that this was a classic RICO conspiracy. And we then started digging deeper into the law, trying to figure out what the elements of RICO are that would apply to BDS, who the BDS operatives would be that we'd ask for prosecution, and who they were tied to in terms of foreign terror organization. So that took about a year worth of research and writing to come up with the letter that you referenced that we sent to the DOJ around July of this year.
Right. And so tell me, what is a RICO violation?
Okay, RICO violation, it usually comprises several elements. One is you have to have a group of people. The classic example is the mafia, where you had the five families in New York City and otherwise, where they were a shadowy organization. We all knew that they had a common goal, but they hid it well enough that they weren't subject to prosecution as an entire entity, that you could pick off lower level people, but you couldn't get the entire organization and thus take down the head of the snake. So the elements of the RICO prosecution that we're looking at here is, we know that there's a group of people. It's BDS activists, And generally, it's Students for Justice in Palestine, American Muslims for Palestine, Muslim Students Association, and a group called Dream Defenders out of Florida. We believe that they act in a coordinated fashion at the behest of designated terror organizations, usually Hamas, PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, to advance the nonviolent attacks on Israel using boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And so the specific predicate, under RICO, you have to have what's called a predicate crime, and it could be anything from extortion to providing material support to terrorism as part of the Patriot Act after 9/11. And that is what we're alleging, is that by doing the legwork for Hamas, Hezbollah, PFLP, et cetera, these BDS groups are in effect providing them with the material support that they need to spread the war against Israel into the United States, and especially on U.S. campuses.
So
and we also believe that there's two ways that this goes, that they're also, we think that they're receiving funding from the offshore terrorist groups as well.
Okay, so just to boil this down, we're talking about groups like American Muslims for Palestine, Students for Justice in Palestine, the Muslim Students Association. These are groups that are very active on U.S. college campuses. What would you say is the mandate of these groups? How are they operating to achieve the goals of foreign terrorist organizations? And then what tangible evidence do we have of the relationship between these designated terrorist groups and these particular groups that I just mentioned?
I'll go to the second question first, and that is that if you look at, for example, how an organization like Dream Defenders has actively cooperated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They send delegations to where PFLP headquarters are in the territories administered by Israel, and they then, in exchange, these Dream Defenders put into schools curricula that promote anti-Israel sentiment. And that goes to your first question. Their goal is the same goal as the Arab League and as many, as Hamas, Hezbollah. It's to destroy Israel. What we've found is that there are significant sort of carryover ties between the old Arab League boycott of Israel and the BDS movement. And if you remember what the Arab League boycott was all about, it was the Arab League's way, when they couldn't win militarily, to weaken Israel financially to the point that they could simply exterminate the Jewish state. That agenda is what we believe BDS's agenda is. And actually, if you look through some of their materials, they set out sort of a guideline of their organizing document, and it says that very explicitly. And just recently, I think it was a Muslim Students Association, or AMP group, that was on campus, and they specifically said, we believe that Israel is an apartheid state and should be eliminated.
Right. So those who say, well, this is free speech, your retort to that is, well, actually, when you provide material support to a designated terrorist group, it's without the element of protected speech. And now we're talking about potential criminal behavior. And so this group, Dream Defenders, which, by the way, I believe Linda Sarsour is on the board of, is organizing trips for people, delegations to go meet with PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This is what you're alleging, which is a designated terrorist group, and then coming back and implementing the goals and strategies that they potentially discussed. How about this group, American Muslims for Palestine? Who are they? What are their connections to nefarious groups?
It's a very similar connection. These groups, and I apologize, one of them was founded by CARE, and I believe that it's AMP. And CARE is the organization that also was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation case that found that Americans were funneling money to Hamas. So these are all groups that nominally are religious groups or cultural groups, but they all have the same. I don't think that I've ever seen MSA or AMP do anything other than attack Israel. So who are they? I believe that they're just the alter ego of the foreign terror organizations offshore that are pulling the strings.
So when you say alter ego, though, are there finances that are flowing from foreign organizations to AMP and then being distributed here within the United States. Materials are created for student groups. My understanding from, I think it was Jonathan Shanzer's testimony before Congress on the issue, is that AMP also provides materials for students to use to advocate on campus. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. They use Twitter to forward PFLP material to their followers, and they
Actual
also create
PFLP material, actual Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine material.
Yeah, they don't even hide it. It's just it's not even really a repackaging. They simply take it and they put it on their on their course materials. For example, when they go to schools, and they give credit to the PFLP.
How about the
even.
money? Is money coming from top down?
That's something that we believe there has to be, but this is actually why we've gone to the Department of Justice and asked for an investigation, because when it comes to money, there are many ways to hide the movement of money internationally. And, we as a legal foundation, private parties can't really get that kind of information. Only the government, with its powers of subpoena and document production, et cetera, can dig in and find that. Now, speaking of Dr. Shanzer, he actually testified twice to Congress, and in the second bit of testimony later in the year, he identified the PLO as having been running a war room, I believe, in Europe, where they are providing funding to BDS groups. So I'm not sure where he got that information from, but I believe it's absolutely the case. There's no other way that they could have the resources that they have without getting money from foreign sources.
And after all, these are the same people who were behind the Holy Land Foundation, which was taken down for providing material support for Hamas. My understanding is that the same people, some of the same people who were working at Holy Land Foundation went and opened up other organizations, including American Muslims for Palestine. What did they learn then from their experience at Holy Land Foundation, perhaps how to conceal their activities and so forth?
I think that that's what they learned, is conceal your activities. Don't make it as obvious as the Holy Land folks did. Make sure that you, especially with regard to the financial movements, make sure that it goes through intermediaries and that it's cloaked well enough that only, that nobody really could find it outside of somebody with the government powers of subpoenas and warrants.
And so would you say that there's any truth to the claim that this boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is grassroots, that it's a student-led initiative by well-meaning people who want to advocate for human rights in the Palestinian context? Is there a more sinister top-down approach here?
It's much more sinister. If you go back through the history of BDS, it was formed around the time of the September 11th attacks, when there were certain conferences allegedly taking place in Africa and elsewhere to combat racism and discrimination. And those were taken over by radical groups that were promoting an anti-Israel agenda. So those groups included Iran and some of the more notorious terrorist groups like Hezbollah, and they created BDS. They stepped away from it after a while because it then became something that looks like a grassroots organization. But if you look at still today, the BDS governing body is comprised of 5 different terrorist organizations, including Hamas and the PLO and PFLP. So they
Wait a minute, step back. So the actual organization, what is the name of the organization? This is BNC that you're talking about, right? What does the acronym stand for?
The BDS National Committee.
The BDS National Committee on its board has designated terrorist groups, and AMP is associated with BNC? It's a member of BNC?
Well, AMP takes its marching orders from BNC. I mean, because the BNC sets out the worldwide agenda for BDS. And so, they have hidden their connections to other organizations, but it's very clear that they all adhere to the same BDS call. They'll even say that BDS sprung up from Palestinian civil society. That's actually 100% false. If you look at the BNC website, they'll tell you that they have terrorist organizations at their foundation.
They openly advertise this. So what is the DOJ, the Department of Justice, waiting for? You submitted this letter. What can we do to assist law enforcement? Has there been any indication from law enforcement that they're going to be looking into this? I mean, your memo shows all these organizations with pretty direct connections to terrorist groups. And your RICO case, as well, they're taking their marching orders from BNC, which openly advertises its affiliation with designated terrorist groups. Why isn't law enforcement doing anything here?
I think that in large part they have, in general, a backlog at the Department of Justice. So it takes time for them to get to this. And second, they need political pressure to let them know that many people, including politicians who represent, in Senate and the House, want this investigation to start. It's the question is a great question because Dr. Schanzer's testimony has been before Congress now for 2 years, I believe. It laid out the case. It laid out the evidentiary case for what the RICO letter is alleging. And you would think that at some point, Congress would have said to the Department of Justice, what's going on with this? As far as I know, they're not. So we need them to be motivated to ask this question.
Obviously, the Jewish community should start speaking out against this issue and using their influence to get law enforcement to look into it. This is a national security issue. This is about the radicalization of our students on campus, and allegedly this radicalization being directed by designated terrorist groups. Unbelievable. Mark, thank you so much for your incredible work, and we support you, we support what you're doing, and thank you for your time coming on today.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Gabriel Groisman is a lawyer, writer, speaker, and he is the mayor of Belle Harbor, Florida. Mayor Groisman is active in the Jewish community on various fronts, including speaking regularly to groups about fighting anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitic Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, or BDS. Mayor Groisman wrote and passed the nation's first municipal anti-BDS ordinance in December of 2015, and he was the first in the nation to codify a uniform definition of anti-Semitism in December of 2017. Mayor Groisman's groundbreaking ordinances continue to spread across the country. In 2016, Ambassador Danny Danon, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, invited Mayor Groisman to speak at 2 conferences hosted at the UN to discuss his efforts in fighting the BDS movement. In his private life, Gabriel Groisman is the founder of Groisman Law, PLLC, a boutique law firm where he focuses on trademark law, anti-corruption, and commercial litigation. Mayor Groisman, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'll only answer you if you call me Gabe because I consider you a friend. So.
Okay, Gabe. So let's have a friendly conversation then.
I like the introduction, but the part you left out was that you were the moderator of one of those 2 United Nations events.
That is correct, and thank you for reminding me. You were excellent, by the way. And that's when we first formally met, I think, right? Okay, so I am so impressed with your foresight, your ability to get things done, the fact that you passed the first municipal BDS law. Tell me a little bit about why you passed that law, how it came to be, what the scope of the law is, and the effect of it, please.
So I've been watching the growth of the BDS movement from about 2006, 2007 on, and seeing how it kept growing and growing, and watching the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community at large basically ignoring it. And it hit close to home. At that point, I was just a city council member in Belle Harbor, and the United Church of Christ, one of the largest Protestant churches in the country, had passed a nationwide boycott and divestment resolution. And I remember reading about it, and just something popped in my head saying, where have I heard of the UCC before, the United Church of Christ before? And I realized the church in my very own community, in my very own municipality, which is called Church by the Sea, the small underscript under it is a United Church of Christ church. And it just, I said, I can't believe it. This is now coming to my own hometown. And, I had been following, at this point, the beginnings of the anti-BDS movement. The state of South Carolina, with the great Alan Clemens, Representative Alan Clemens from South Carolina, had just passed the first anti-BDS state law in the country. And I said, there has to be a way to do this in our municipality. And to clarify what this law is and what most of these laws are, the law doesn't prevent somebody from boycotting Israel. can boycott Israel, you can hate Israel, you can even be anti-Semitic.
You're free to be a bigot in this country. That is First Amendment protected speech.
Yeah, absolutely. But what you can't do is that if you, and when I'm saying you is an important distinction, you, your corporation, your company, your organization, is part of the boycott movement, not just of Israel in Bal Harbour, of any authorized trading partner of the United States, then we can exercise our First Amendment right as a municipality, as a government entity, not to enter into a contract with you. And in December 2015, we were the first municipality to pass an anti-BDS ordinance. It was an incredible exercise to turn, I basically grabbed the South Carolina law and turned it into a municipal ordinance, which is not, it's basically the simplification of a state law into a city ordinance. And it's interesting because Bal Harbour has an interesting past. It was founded in 1947 by some very visionary and wealthy individuals who wanted to create a beautiful oasis, which they did, just north of Miami Beach, for themselves. And themselves means no Jews, no blacks, no Arabs. And that's on the deeds of every single home in Bal Harbour.
Wow.
And it wasn't until 1984 that it was overturned and Jews were allowed to purchase homes in Bal Harbour. So it was really an interesting time in our city.
And now with you as the mayor, it has become a city that does not tolerate discrimination against anyone based on their national origin, gender, religion, whatever ethnicity protected category you have.
Yeah, not just that. We've been at the forefront of fighting for the mentally handicapped in our community. And these days with social media, even a small community of under 10,000 people, you pass something that matters and you put it out on social media, and before you know it, it's picked up literally all over the world.
Because, you know, I mean, you really, that's the point, is that the BDS movement, even though it couches itself in civil rights language and human rights language, really, it's the antithesis to that. Because what they are doing is picking an individual or a corporation and targeting them based on their religion, based on their national origin, because they disagree with the policies of a state thousands of miles away. You know, my favorite example is if you have a problem, for example, with China's one-child policy, or China used to have a one-child policy, you don't turn around to the local Chinese man who runs the bodega and discriminate against him. But that's exactly what they are doing. And you've also talked about how it is really not a non-violent movement. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. All this discussion that you hear from commentators and from columnists about how BDS is not anti-Semitic, it sounds like to me that they've never been to a BDS activity on a college campus or anywhere in the country, because in practice, in actuality, it is clearly anti-Semitic in the way it's practiced, and it is violent. It's talked about as a non-violent means, but I get calls because of my activity, mostly on social media, from college students all over the country, unfortunately primarily in the University of California systems, but also in my alma mater, University of Michigan, who get physically assaulted while they're walking across campus every day. And why? Because they're Jewish. And it really puts them in this really precarious position of making the decision at 18, 19 years old. Is it my time in life to stand up for myself, for my people, or do I just want to be quiet, pretend I'm not Jewish, pretend I'm not affiliated with Israel, and just have fun over college like most 18-year-olds want to have?
Right. I mean, we see this clearly at our work at the Lawfare Project, where Jewish students, whether they are proud, open Zionist or not, whether they wear a Star of David or a kippah or not, are being targeted with violence and harassment and intimidation. We had a client, Daniel Visal at Temple University, who was punched in the face by an SJP associate for approaching the table at a tabling week and saying, hey guys, let's talk. Let's talk about Palestine and the occupation. Let's have a civil conversation. To which they responded with a punch in the face. Unbelievable.
Yeah, just to interject, the timing couldn't be worse. The movement now on the left in the United States, generally speaking, of intersectionality, where they say, you know, I'm an immigrant, so people discriminate against me, and you're Palestinian, so the Israelis discriminate against you, supposedly. Now, and I'm African American, so the police discriminate against me. So the argument goes, our causes intersect at a certain point, we should march together, which is why you see in the Charter of Black Lives Matter the freedom of the Palestinian people from the oppression of Israel. It makes no sense, right? But you put those things together, and it really, what the result is an explosion, and the people that are subject to that explosion, unfortunately, are the Jews, and the Jews on campus all over the country.
Well, people like Jonathan Schanzer, for example, from FDD, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and Mark Greendorfer from the Sahara Legal Institute have been doing incredible work documenting how the BDS movement is not this grassroots, student-led initiative, as we're led to believe, but is very top-down orchestrated from groups like AMP, American Muslims for Palestine, which is just the former leaders of the Holy Land Foundation, which went down for their material support for the designated terrorist group Hamas.
The ones who weren't arrested or deported.
Correct, and BNC. But this is a top-down directed initiative by Islamist groups, often by terrorists, designated terrorist groups who are on the board of BNC, who are working together, allegedly, strategically organizing and providing support, financial and otherwise, to groups engaged in the BDS movement and directing them to harass Jews on campus and otherwise delegitimize Israel, the Jewish state.
Right, so the SJP movement, the Students for Justice in Palestine movement, which I believe they started it started in California for sure. I believe it was in the early 2000s. In the last 4 or 5 years or so, all put themselves under the umbrella of the national SJP and NSJP, who runs the conferences. And their conferences are just replete with speakers who are calling for violence against Jews, calling for violence against Israelis. And again, when people try to say that the BDS movement is a peaceful protest for the Palestinians. And the other thing is, what's mostly missing from the BDS movement is Palestinians. Right. Because the majority of Palestinians do not support the boycott of Israeli businesses, because the livelihood of most Palestinians is through Israeli businesses. And the path to peace is economic cooperation.
What deeply disturbs me is the involvement of groups like the ACLU, the National Lawyers Guild, and this Palestine Legal, which fashions itself as a civil rights legal group, it's anything but, who are now getting involved arguing that state laws like the Kansas law, like the Arizona law, I think there was a Texas anti-discrimination law, are un-American, are a violation of free speech. Isn't that the antithesis to a civil rights movement? Didn't the ACLU used to support legislation that prevented people from engaging in commercial discrimination, targeting blacks, targeting Jews, targeting gays and the like? That's what the BDS laws do.
Yeah, it's the same thing. These laws do the same thing as laws of the past have done, that put us in our municipality and all over the country, where when you sign a government contract, you have to affirm that you're not going to discriminate against someone because of their race, because of their religion, because of their national origin, now because of their sexual orientation. And you don't hear the ACLU complaining about those laws. And where it really gets scary is now these organizations that have now come together under this rubric of intersectionality. Now, how does that play into national politics and party politics? And that's really where things get scary.
Well, that's a whole, other topic, the fact that the Democratic movement has embraced people like Linda Sarsour, who serves on the board of Dream Defenders, which is connected to PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a designated terrorist group, and this woman is now being embraced by Democratic leaders. It is a very, very scary turn to the ultra-radical, to the ultra-anti-Semitic.
But that's my point on, it's exactly my point on how dangerous this intersectionality movement is, because you take a Linda Sarsour, and why is she and how can she even be connected to the Dream Defenders? That's dreamers.
She sits on their board.
Right, but that's children of illegal immigrants that came in that are looking for status. That has no connection, should have no connection to what's happening in the Middle East.
Well, it should have no connection to a designated terrorist group, but apparently it's been researched and reported that they have been taking trips of Americans to go meet with PFLP leaders, and that's walking the fine line of potentially violating material support for terrorism laws. But I want to dovetail a little bit, because you also had the municipality of Belle Harbor adopt the definition of anti-Semitism. Why is that so important? Why should a municipality actually codify a definition of anti-Semitism?
I think it's very important because you can't fix a problem unless you can define it. If the language of anti-Semitism has changed in the United States, and most of the time you don't see anti-Semitism expressed in the classic sense of the word out in the open in the United States. Now you see it hidden and changed, the language has changed to anti-Israel. Instead of going after the Jews, they're going after the Jewish state. I'll give you an example. In downtown Miami, in a neighborhood called Wynwood, which is an arts district, some perpetrators spray painted BDS in front of every Jewish-owned business. Wherever they found a mezuzah, they spray painted BDS. The city of Miami police went out there. There's an area they're trying to develop, and they were investigating as vandalism. They had no idea what BDS meant, nor should they, right? So they didn't know what BDS was. They didn't know that they should be investigating this, as we argued, as a hate crime.
Right.
And we went, a group of active individuals in the community went and met with the City of Miami Police and explained to them what the BDS movement is and how they were literally targeting Jewish businesses, telling people, don't buy here because these are Jews. And what this law does, it takes a definition that was drafted by the State Department under Obama. It was then shelved, but it was there and wasn't used for anything. And that definition gives the classic forms of anti-Semitism and also the more modern forms of anti-Semitism.
And directs law enforcement how to identify what is a hate crime and what is not a hate crime.
So it's very carefully crafted. And since I was the first one to do this, and as a lawyer, I was very careful not to cross those lines. I didn't want to define for law enforcement what is a hate crime. The hate crime statutes are there, and in every state in the United States they have them, and that's, you know.
But it goes to motive, how to recognize the motive that you need to identify, whether it's a racial animus, a religious animus, to have a hate crime.
Absolutely, and I'll tell you that within a month of passing the Anti-Semitism Definition Act, which I'd like to say that before it was passed, I got letters of support from both Democrats and Republicans, U.S. Congressman Debbie Wasserman Schultz on one side, Carlos Corbello on the other side, and it was very important to do that, and we got it passed, and within 1 month, the Miami-Dade Chiefs of Police Association, which is 34 different police departments, adopted the definition for their use, which therefore now in their departments, when they're looking at an anti-Semitic act or a potential anti-Semitic act, they have something to look at to help educate them to define if it's a hate crime. I really
hope you are working with other mayors, other municipalities to help them, you know, replicate the amazing work that you are doing. Just to your last point, and I want to end with this, you know, frequently also in my work we come up with the defense, we're not anti-Semitic, we don't hate you because you're a Jew, we hate you because you're a Zionist. And, you know, to me the best retort to that is the most obvious. Zionism is the civil rights movement of the Jewish people. Jerusalem, Israel, is so central to the Jewish religion. We pray towards Israel. We yearn to return to Israel in most all of our prayers. We have holidays, you know, fashioned around that. You cannot separate the two. But most importantly, only Jews are given a political litmus test. You don't see these progressive groups going to the African American community saying, hey, what's your stance on apartheid? Or going to, you know, the Chinese community and saying, do you agree with a one-child policy or not? Only Jews do they target and give that political litmus test. Hey, Jew, are you pro-occupation? Are you anti-occupation? Are you a Zionist or not?
I'm sorry to cut you off. I think that should give us strength, right? Because the reason why we're giving that litmus test, as unfair as it is because of our successes as a community. Because of our success, not only within our community, but without our community. Outside in the general population in the world, the good that the Jewish community does, whether it's in business or in philanthropy or in technology or in science. And because of that, we're held to a higher standard. We should be proud to be held to that standard.
But it's completely different. I'm sorry. There is no excuse to target someone based on their religion and give them a political litmus test.
I agree.
You know, depending on whether you should exclude them or hate them or not. And last point before we go, there are so many out there who have said, forget the BDS movement. It's not such a big deal. It's not having an economic impact. Forget them. I think that's a very dangerous point of view, because the point of the BDS movement is not necessarily to economically hinder Israel, although that's what they're trying to do, but is to delegitimize Israel, paint Israel in the public dialogue and you know, in the common light as something that should be hated, that should be targeted, that is a colonizer, that is an occupier. It's a state engaged in war crimes, and that narrative has been infusing the public space and especially the campuses. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree 100%. The purpose of the BDS movement is to target that generation. So our generation, although we're not that much older than those in college right now, that wasn't around when we were in our more formative years. So we have a strong backbone. We know what Israel is. We know what the Jewish community is. We know what Israel isn't. Despite what anybody's going to say, they can yell lies from the rooftop from morning to night. It's not going to change my opinion. I know what the facts are. But if you take a full generation of students who spend 4 years on college campuses, sometimes 6 or 7 or 8 years,
bombarded constantly,
bombard them with lies and lies and lies. Even if they don't take it at 100%, what's internalized the theory is, and I think it's a good theory, it's a dangerous theory, but is 80% of it, right? If Israel's not an apartheid state, for example, the internalization of that after hearing that lie for 4 or 5 years could be, well, it must be pretty bad. Maybe it's not technically apartheid.
There's something wrong.
And what happens when that generation gets into positions of leadership?
Exactly. Oh. Well, listen, we're really lucky that we have you in a position of leadership.
We're lucky that we have you in a position of leadership.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Safe travels back to Florida. It was wonderful to have you on set.
Thank you so much.
Born in Paris, famed war photographer Jonathan Alperi moved to the United States in the early 90s. He started his career in photography right after high school, working for local Chicago newspapers, and has gone on to work for Getty Images and Polaris. He has published photo essays in Elle magazine, Glamour magazine, the BBC Le Monde, and many other media outlets. Jonathan's career spans over a decade. His work has brought him to over 25 countries. He has covered 13 conflict zones, including in the Middle East and North Africa, the South Caucasus, Europe, North America, and Central Asia. His new book, entitled The Shattered Lens, and published by Simon & Schuster, chronicles the time Jonathan was held captive in Syria by Islamist rebels and is now being turned into a feature film. Jonathan is a good friend, someone I often talk politics with, and we are pleased to have him with us today. Welcome, Jonathan. How are you?
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So I want to get right into it. First, tell us a little bit about what got you into war photography in the first place and what it entails.
Everybody has a different reason why they decide to join this kind of business, which is a very taxing kind of career and a life that you decide for yourself in terms of the sacrifice that comes out of it. I remember a good friend of mine described it as, before I started right early in my career, and it's kind of a life of a monk. You know, you have to suffer like everybody else. You have to be in their circumstances that are drastically different from how it is.
And dangerous.
Quite dangerous sometimes, depending on the conflict that you cover. Obviously, Syria was more dangerous than Libya, and Libya was more dangerous than Afghanistan, so on and so forth. As a child, I was always very interested in history, and that was always my main interest. And I read a lot, and I was always thriving to learn more and more about what had happened in the past, especially in European history. And this was a catalyst for me to, when I came to an age where I had to decide, well, what am I going to do with my life? And by the time I was a senior in high school, I knew war was my calling. And I did not want to be a soldier, so the kind of career that would thrust you forward into conflict, photography was a good one. So photography for me was just a medium to take the war aspect of the life that I wanted to have and inject myself in historical events that society create for themselves and people, and war being a main catalyst for that.
So tell me though, in terms of actually being a war photographer, what exactly do you do when you land in a conflict zone to the point where you are embedded with, whether it's an Islamist rebel group or an army, a state army? How do you get from A to B?
It's a good question. Most of the work that's being done for guys like us before we get on the field and actually pick up a camera and start taking pictures is a whole aspect of making contacts, proper contacts. And fixers, for example, a fixer is someone who gets you around, speaks the language, makes all the introduction. He's kind of a babysitter in some ways. And once you've established proper contacts, and hopefully contacts that you can trust, then you can actually organize your trip, and you go there, and you have enough contacts on the ground that will lead you to an area where there's fighting, whatever you're looking for. If it's civilian casualties or combat, then you decide on the ground what you want to do.
So you were in, what was it, 13 conflict zones, and then you found yourself in Syria because obviously what we're facing now are a lot of conflicts that deal with Islamist terrorist groups throughout the Middle East. And you were captured by rebels. How did that happen? How long were you captured for? How did you survive? How did you get back here to the United States?
So this was my third trip into Syria, and I'd been there twice before, and this time I decided to go to a different front line, which was very active at the time in 2013, which is the Zabadani, Rif Damascus area, not too far from Damascus. In order to go into that part of Syria, you had to go through Lebanon, northern Lebanon, which was much trickier because Hezbollah controls a lot of that border area. So you have to go through them, you know, and then through the Syrian border and then into the combat zone, which was at the time in the Kalamoun Mountains, which was held by the rebels. And everybody was going to Aleppo and doing, so I wanted to do something a bit different. I didn't want to immerse myself with everybody else and maybe cover another dark zone of the conflict. So I spent 10 days covering a battle that was going on, mostly government forces, shelling and clashing with rebel forces, using a lot of Hezbollah infantry to support the government, the Syrian government, obviously. And after 10 days, I decided to go to another area, not too far, but 2 hours south, or closer to Zabadani, which was very dangerous. And the rebel force that was supposed to greet me obviously was aware I was coming, and they decided instead to kidnap me to get money for ransom.
What was the name of this rebel force?
They were, I don't remember the name. I try to forget some of these things, but they were the largest force in the area, about 1,000 strong, and a lot of these guys were locals. And so they knew the law of the land very well, the terrain, and for them, it felt like they were protecting their homes in some ways. But when I was kidnapped, and I found out afterwards that there was a lot of guys from al-Nusra that were pouring in order to supplement these forces were being defeated by Hezbollah. It was a much more efficient force.
So you think these were local men who basically had taken up arms, and then potentially al-Nusra had come in and also infiltrated this group. So they were an Islamist group? What were the principles they were guided by?
So they were Islamic, it's true, but you have, as you know, there are different degrees of it. It's not like they were ISIS, otherwise I most likely wouldn't be here today. But they prayed 5 times a day, there was no drinking, they followed a very strict regimen in terms of what Islam can propose when it comes to that kind of intensity. And I think when that's very common for any kinds of conflict, you become more of a radical as you go through war because you see your friend get killed, there's suffering, so you become more hardened. So I think for a lot of these guys, it became much more of a religious affair, but I don't think it was the case in the beginning because that part of Syria was never really an Islamic area. I think Syria was more moderate when it came to that compared to other parts like Pakistan or Iraq and other parts of the Middle East. And therefore, but I remember they were praying 5 times a day, and they were becoming pretty hardcore. Yeah.
So what was it like being in captivity? They kept you where?
So I spent 3 months, which is actually in some ways a small amount of time compared to other journalists who were kidnapped for 1.5 years, a year, 2 years for some of them. The problem that I had was the military situation was very bad, so we were being attacked constantly. So it's very tricky. You're kidnapped, and at the same time, there are bombings constantly. So you're chained up to, at one point I was chained up to a bed for a couple of weeks and blindfolded, and there are bombs dropping 50 yards away, 20 yards away, and there's clashes.
You were there for 3 months.
Yeah.
And then you were finally released?
Yeah.
How? How did that come about?
So from what I can say publicly, it was a Syrian man. It was a businessman, but also in the parliament, so close to Bashar al-Assad's regime. And he wanted to be out of a blacklist that was written by the European Union and the United States of powerful Syrian men who were close to the regime. And if you were on that list, you could not use your international assets. They would freeze your bank accounts, and that was his case. And therefore, he was trying to get out of that list by buying himself a good name by paying a ransom and getting out.
Okay. And so since you have been released, you wrote the book, The Shattered Lens. You have been interviewed on major news networks, and you've also been talking a lot about political Islam or Islamism in Europe and what's happening in Europe. You were born and raised in France.
Yes.
Let's start with France. What is going on over there, and what could we potentially learn from France right now?
It's a very good question, because it's true. The European situation is a very good example to what could happen in the United States if you're not careful. Europe has given up a lot of its national identity through the European Union since the 50s, and it's been a very slow process in removing borders. And by removing borders, obviously once people come in mostly from Greece or southern Italy, Sicily, and working their way north, then once they're in the continent, they can just move around and go wherever they want, which is mostly Northern Europe. So you've had, and this has been going on for decades, and Europe now is faced with the reality where the numbers have become so great that
But these are numbers of what? Migrants coming from where? Exactly, from conflict zones?
So recently, since the last big wave, which was 2015, when an estimated about 1 million migrants came in, mostly for Germany's purpose, who needs labor and needs consumers, because its demography is collapsing.
Where are they from, though, originally?
So a lot of them, well, that's the big question, because the media, the technical name is Syrian refugees. But the reality is that they're not from Syria. Overwhelmingly, probably about 80 to 90%, they come from Africa, and Black Africa. And so therefore they're not war refugees, they're economic refugees, which is very different under EU law. EU law makes a very distinct difference between these two.
Are they assimilating? I mean, France is liberté, égalité, fraternité. The whole point is you're French before you're whatever your previous nationality or your religion is. So what does the landscape look like? We hear about no-go zones. We hear about anti-Semitic attacks. We hear about politicians pandering, to Islamism. What's going on there?
So the first part of your question is, it's true that France used to assimilate people. And assimilate is what you said means you become French and then you're second to where you come from. So if you come from Algeria, you're French first and Algerian second. It's the only way this could work in order to have a unified nation which functions. And this was given up probably after the 70s, early 70s, when we gave that up. We were saying, well, you are Algerian first, or you're Moroccan first and French second. And obviously the consequences of that are dire, because now you have a very community-based nation where you have entire areas which are called no-go zones in France, and these are numbers that came out by the Secret Service in France, and they made it public. About 350.
350 no-go zones.
Exactly.
There was a time when you had U.S. commentators talking about the no-go zones in France, and they were reprimanded, and they were saying that's absolutely not true. And you're saying it is true. It's
very true. I mean, it's common knowledge in Europe. No one wants to talk about it because it's still kind of a taboo subject, because if you talk about it in Europe, you're being called a racist, a Nazi, all these terrible things, which doesn't make any sense. And 350, but France is not the only problem. Sweden has 55 now, and Sweden is a much smaller nation. They let, since 2015, about 150,000 migrants out of 10 million population. It's a big number. And they do not have a tradition of assimilation the way France has had for the, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s, when the Italians, the Greeks, and the Spaniards were coming in. So they don't know what to do with it. And now you have entire areas which have their own laws. And their own entities.
Assuming a Sharia law zone.
I think this is the goal. I think ultimately it's not happening now, because I think the great strength that Islamic movements have in Europe is patience, which we have forgotten as Europeans, as Westerners. And they understand that, so they play the system against us. And
give me an example. How are they playing the system against
Well, for example, you have a lot of examples in France of a Muslim man bringing his wife, a Muslim woman, to the doctor or to a hospital. She's sick or whatever, she needs to give birth, right? And so 99% of the time, the doctor is a Westerner, a man usually, and sometimes a woman. And the Muslim doesn't want that, because it's against his law to have, for him, a Christian man, touch his wife to give, who's about to give birth. So you have a lot of incidents, doctors getting attacked and all kinds of problems. when you have these kinds of situations, then there will never be an understanding. Things are not going to combine into a proper country where things are going to be unified and we're all going to...
How about the French public? Are they not pushing back against politicians, or do the politicians find it more in their favor to pander to these so-called migrant communities?
So, two things. Number one, if you're France, you don't control anymore. The European Union controls everything. 85% of French laws are decided in Brussels, not in France. So therefore, someone like Macron, he has no power, or very little. So he can say whatever he wants, no one's listening, because behind the EU is Germany. So it's, you know, since you removed borders, then there's not much you can do.
So what accounts then for Europe, and specifically, you know, even the EU Trade Commission, actually turning quite anti-Israel and anti-Semitic? You have the French Trade Commission issuing discriminatory labeling requirements. Belgium just banned shechita, which is ritual slaughter. Some actually say that Belgium did it to harm the Muslim community because they eat halal, and the Jewish community was just harmed as a consequence. But you have, you know, tons of discriminatory policies. You have the Belgian trade union just came out saying that Jews are harvesting Arab children organs. This is classic anti-Semitism. Yeah. Why are we seeing the resurgence of classic anti-Semitism by European leaders?
It's a very interesting question, and the answer is very simple. Number one, the big catalyst for that issue that you're talking about is the Israel-Palestine conflict. And for a lot of young Muslim men in Europe, this is a struggle, even if it's symbolic, even if you don't actually go out there and fight. This is a struggle that's being kept alive, who keeps these struggles, you know, against one another. And that's number one. And number two, I think, and Belgium is a great example, has 30% of its population of Brussels is now Muslim.
30%?
Yeah, the 25 to 30, it's huge. A lot of Moroccans.
Which would not be a problem if there was a level of assimilation.
Which there are none.
To Western values.
Right, exactly, but there are none whatsoever. So they're afraid. These political figures are afraid. I mean, in France, you know, you had these riots in 2005. You have them regularly now in cities. No one talks about it. It takes one person getting killed by the police, or it takes just anything for these suburbs to rise up and just blow out. So they're very much afraid about that, and I believe that's the main reason why they're publicly going after Israel. But I think between the curtains, this story is quite different.
And they honestly think pandering to this anti-Semitic, anti-Israel narrative is going to somehow quell a mob that's constantly boiling up.
Because these politicians are not courageous politicians. So you're right. If they were courageous, they'd be like, this is not what we should be doing. I think they're just kicking the can down the road. But at the end of the day, the wall will be there. And when it's going to hit, it's going to be very bad. So
if we were to conclude this segment with one message, what is the ultimate message that you have to an American audience, given that you are watching what's happening in Europe? What are the lessons that we can learn here?
I think the whole progressive democratic movement in this country is wrong when they're saying that nationalism leads to fascism. I think that's a very simple understanding of what nationalism actually is, especially in France. For example, any European countries, we have a very long and gruesome history. We've earned the right to be nationalistic. We went through many wars. We've given a lot of blood. A lot of our sons died. I mean, talk about World War I. 1.3 million French soldiers.
Nationalism in Europe, I think, has a much different connotation than it does here in the United States. Well, patriotism here in the United States, freedom, democracy, love of the United States, you know, that's one thing. Nationalism in Europe, on the other hand, it has that tinge of fascism because of Europe's recent past, which is why probably it's more easily manipulated and called bad and evil because of the Holocaust and because of World War II.
Right, so you're referring to World War II, which is a significant part of our history, but remember, we have a 15th century history, talking about 13 years. It's significant, I'm not taking away from anything. What I'm saying is That's why I said this very long historical lineage that we have, which made us who we are, and which are very deep roots. And once you remove that and you try to break them, which is what they're doing, by removing borders, and if you're a nationalist or patriot, you're a fascist, and so on and so forth. Doesn't work because, and you can see actually nationalist movements are rising everywhere.
Right.
Italy
Ironically, the anti-nationalist movement has created the rise of the far right, almost neo-Nazi aligned, sometimes, yes, absolutely, neo-Nazi aligned parties in Europe. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Good luck with your book, good luck with the movie, and you promised me you would invite me on the red carpet to the premiere of your movie.
I will do so.
Right? Okay, thank you. I hope that you're as outraged as I am to learn that we have groups affiliated with designated terrorist groups operating within our borders with impunity. Let's take a warning from people like Jonathan Alperi as to what's going on in Europe, and of course congratulate people like Gabe Groisman, the mayor of Bell Harbor, for using the legislative system to stop this type of hatred. That's it for us on this episode of Outspoken on JBS. Tune in next time.